Hey YouTube, so I know my last video was a little bit long and kind of disorganized, so I decided to put together a quick slide deck and just kind of walk you through what I've been learning and what I've been trying with my new project. So let's get right into it. I built up a new website, called modulanceai.com. It's going to have a bunch of collection of tools in it. So this is kind of like my fourth mini AI dev project, but I want to get right into it. So what have I been doing until now? If you didn't watch my last video, it's okay. I'll kind of give a quick summary. I first built a quick bio website just as a proof of concept. I just put in a bunch of my data from my resume and just said, hey, let's make a bio website. And that actually worked pretty good. It was not like a total entire one shot. I did have to tweak it and play around with it, but it was pretty successful. I just taken up some data and building out like a quick static web page using React and some nice CSS and some styling. I even got like a semi-good dark mode working together, but it was all right. And then I went to build on kind of like my combination dual app, which was one to build the JSON builder. And that one kind of failed. It was really complicated to kind of get the UI to kind of understand how, a JSON objects are built, how to add, new values into the middle, how to add values onto lists. It was just getting really too complicated. JSON is not necessarily the simplest data object to kind of build in a UI. So that was definitely a failure. And the idea of using the JSON builder was to allow people to go in, build a JSON with their resumes, and then use that to upload their resume in JSON format to then build out a resume. And so the resume builder that I built was actually pretty successful. You didn't get to see a preview of this because I didn't have the application running last time. And this one was a little bit more successful. Again, it was pretty straightforward. It consumes a JSON object, transposes all the components and puts it together into a nice visually looking kind of markdown resume. I didn't work on a PDF because, if you remember, Gemini recommended for me to set up a backend because PDF generation is expensive and difficult and runs best on backend services. So I did not do that. But overall, I would say that one was relatively successful. And then my last one, the one that was like my big push. So, all these were kind of all front-end web applications, and I wanted to test out like a full stack application. So I was actually brainstorming with Gemini in there, and I was asking it to, let's figure out a plan to make a front end and a back end. I started setting up a database, a back end server, and a front end server. It was just having issues with specificity around the API contracts and messing those up. A lot of the code was kind of getting disorganized. Random bugs were kind of happening throughout the process. And so these were my past 4 AI projects. I got a brand new one, which I'll talk about in a second. So a lot of this is all about, just kind of testing the models for different code quality and brainstorming and just seeing how the thought process and how working with vibe coding would happen. And I wanted to start with like a single page web application again. And then I wanted to build on that foundation, right? I wanted to slowly evolve that into a larger code base. Working in, my full-time job and working in an enterprise environment. I know me and my team, we're going to be working on like large code bases and making changes into them as opposed to just building these applications from scratch. And so what I want to kind of do is build a new application that I just keep building and building and building on. I want to get the code really complicated, have a lot of tools and components to it, and then eventually I can treat that as more of like a small startup and then see how well, Windsurf can react in there. Obviously, I'm learning and testing these things in, the office on the actual corporate enterprise projects, but we'll kind of get to more in detail and testing that longer term. So a little bit of learning that I did. I tested with Gemini 2.5 Pro. I do have, a month of free Google AI Premium, and so that's why I was trying to originally testing Gemini 2.5 Pro. It was pretty good at brainstorming. It was asking a lot of the right questions, getting the right clarifications, but ultimately I think the documentation that I created was just, mediocre. When I saw it at first, I thought it was pretty good, and then I worked with Claude 3.7 Sonnet, and I realized that one was just way better, especially because when I exported to a markdown, it was just really thorough, and I'll kind of show you some previews of that in a second. In addition to that, I also tested code generation from O4 Mini, GPT 4.0, and Claude 3.7 Sonnet without the thinking, just less verbose and things like that. And I kind of ran the same prompts on all 3 of them, and the code that I generated, I tested out my other 2 projects with it, and pretty much the code that I generated was just a little bit messier, and I think GPT 4.1 had just a little bit more errors in the code, so it kept trying to fix the errors constantly. But overall, Claude 3.7 Sonnet, when it did complete the entire transaction, the code was actually pretty high quality and thorough and overall pretty good. And so overall, what I'm seeing so far is Claude 3.5 Sonnet is going to be my go-to for brainstorming using the thinking. What's cool is Windsurf has it built into the application, so you don't have to use a separate window on Gemini or anything like that to do the brainstorming. You can just brainstorm into it. We did learn some quick, awesome pointers from the Windsurf team, so thank you for that. For putting all of the documentation that the brainstorming session has into a nice markdown language. I'll give a preview of that. It's pretty good. It's really valuable. And then also using 3.5 Sonnet to actually do the code generation afterwards. I didn't create a new chat window. I just started continuing off of that, and it built out like the base application that I built today. And then eventually I did go to a new chat window and build the next feature into it. And I think that's probably a good breakdown. As like, look, it has the context of your code base because you're working in that code base now. It has that, the specification diagram and documentation there. So it's just going to build off of that. But you can, create a new chat to focus specifically on that new tool or new component or new feature that you're building. One issue that I had with Claude that I didn't see with the other ones, probably I also just used Claude a lot longer, and so it was much more prone to this error potentially over the other ones, because I did, find more success and quality in their code, so I just kept using it more and more. But it does randomly freeze or crash sometimes mid-execution. I went away for like 10 minutes, I came back and it was still executing, and so I just stopped it and tried to resend the same command. The same command didn't really work as well that good again, and so I did some slight rewording, and eventually I got to the point where it was kind of going through and proceeding and successfully going. I didn't create a new chat every time. I feel like setting up the context of telling it that it's an expert front-end developer and all of those things would be a little bit more tedious. My biggest concern here is, if Windsurf is going to charge for every time you hit enter, it will burn through your credits pretty fast. I'm kind of hopeful that if it ever times out, it would just kind of not burn a credit there. I don't know what underneath the hood. Hopefully I can ask Windsurf and get some more clarification there. But overall, Claude had the best performance of the models I tried. It did have this freezing and crashing error, so just be wary of that. Okay, so rules directory. So this is a really cool pointer that I learned again from the Windsurf team, so thank you for this. You want to go into rules into the Windsurf. You go into Windsurf settings, and then you go and you can just type in global, and then you can set up your global rules. You can also set up some local rules. I didn't set up any local rules for my local current project. Maybe if I was working across multiple different repositories and stuff, I would do that eventually, but I think right now I just wanted to just set up some global rules that I wanted to enact on everything. For this project, it's a full front-end project, so what I did was I went to the Windsurf website. I'll put a link in the description below. I copied all of their TypeScript-specific rules, so they only have rules for a handful of different cases so far. I'm hoping that they will expand that to multiple languages and multiple use cases. They did have like a React Native one and TypeScript, and since I was building just a web app, I just went with a basic TypeScript one. I did put in some custom commands, which are on the bottom. I really wanted it to start the server once it finishes completion. One other thing I noticed is sometimes it would like fix an error, and then potentially there would be more errors afterwards, but it wouldn't always fix those errors. So I just put it into my rules like, hey, once you fix the error, go look for, if there are any more errors and try to fix that. Kind of recursively just going into a loop and just fixing all the errors, and hopefully eventually getting to a state where there are no errors in the application. I did see this get hung up once or twice before this, where it, like, even though it finished doing all the commands, there was errors, and then there was an error after I fixed an error, and so I wanted just to be a default rule. After putting this in, the hanging that I mentioned earlier, that was happening regardless, I think, of before and after, so I don't think it's specific to my rule here, but it could be, so just be wary of that. I'm also going to have a node stock that I created in a public repository that I'm going to put in the description below if you want to copy my custom rules in there. But overall, this has been, I think, super helpful in its structuring and forcing, Claude and Codium, Windsurf to actually make the code in a really well-structured way. I'm actually overall pretty pleased with the quality of code after putting some of these things in. It's been really well organized and really well executed. So brand new web app. I got a new domain called Modulance AI. On there, I'm just building like a generic, like basic website that I'm just going to throw a bunch of tools and different things on there. I'm going to kind of use this as like my homepage to kind of prototype applications. Any of these applications that become super valuable or become something real, maybe we'll spin off into a separate application. We'll see if these go anywhere. But this is just kind of like a home for me to kind of prototype and test out a bunch of applications. So when I went through the whole brainstorm discussion, it went through all the notes, it created all the things, and it created this base application without actually populating really any code into the 3 tools that I have listed here. What I was impressed is it chose some icons that went really well with each of the tools, so I was actually impressed by that. Overall, the quality of the page is really good. Light mode and dark mode work pretty well. There is one bug on an initial load where it doesn't pick your browser and your computer setting, which I wanted it to, but I'll work on fixing that. But overall, brand new web app, it's up and running. The website, I'll put a link for that into the chat below as well. So dark mode. If you watched my last video, I had a huge problem with dark mode in the last one, where even though the dark mode was working, it had kind of put a bunch of like custom code in a bunch of different places, and then a custom checks in each of those places to verify. In this one, it's organized way better, where it has its dark settings and its base settings, and it uses that as like the standard template across, and then it just toggles between the state of dark and non-dark. And I think that's been overall way better. And if you look at this page versus like my bio page, which I haven't changed at all yet, you can see that each of the components is also uniform throughout. If you look at the bio website, you'll see that like some of them are like black on black, and then they're black on gray in other areas in the dark mode, which is what it was supposed to be. This page and this web app is way more consistent. Overall, it's still pretty good. There's still that error that I mentioned with the initial load, but I'll get around to fixing that later. Okay, file structure. So this is really cool. So when I talked about brainstorming with Claude 3.7, that was really awesomely well organized, and the markdown, the specification doc that I created was really valuable. As you can see here on the right side, this was the folder structure that I had designed. I explicitly did tell it to say, hey, give me like separate folders for home, calculator, resume builder, sprint estimator, right? Their idea was, hey, if I ever wanted to take these tools, separate them out, and put them into a new application, I could. And so I wanted to have that kind of system agnostic kind of structure. If I ever wanted to pull them out, delete them, whatever I wanted to do with them. Also, it gives me a nice organizational structure to put in new tools onto the page, so I can just put the entire pages in this pattern. And this is really cool. And then you can see on the left here all the code that it generated. It pretty much followed all of this kind of layout. In components, you also have those navigation UI, those generic components, which it's using throughout all of the pages, which is really good. So overall, I would say the code organization structure here went really, really successful. I would say way better than my past few projects at following like a good organizational structure. So yeah, pretty impressed with all of this. Okay, so this was a cool little tidbit with the scientific calculator. When I got around to implementing the scientific calculator, it pretty much went in like a one-shot kind of motion, where I just said, hey, go and implement the scientific calculator. It did get stuck up on a few things, then had a few problems, but once I got past all of those freezes and breaks, it pretty much implemented this entire thing pretty well. It's using kind of like a giant switch case to check which button the user is clicking. It's maintaining the value for the user and just kind of keeping track of the history as well. So overall, pretty good at keeping the values and keeping track of the functions. I was testing like, hey, just making sure the math was working, and I realized that the sine and cosine was using, I forget if it was using radians or degrees, and that's what made me realize that the radian degrees used to be 2 separate buttons. So I gave it a prompt to say, hey, let's make this kind of like a slider switch in my mind, which is what I wanted to do, which is showed that if it's either radian or degree, and it just kind of sliding from left and right. It decided that it wanted to do a different approach, where it's just going to replace them with a single button and then put a highlight on the top left with radian or degree. This is 80% of the way there. I would say like calculators probably do this actually in reality, and so this is really nice. The only problem here is that the radian and degrees, once it's set to radian, the button should show degrees, right? And then the same thing when the calculator is set to degrees, the button should show radian, so you could switch back, right? So that's the part that's a little bit aligned, and this is the type of things that AI will sometimes think that it's doing it correctly, but after you look at it and pay more attention to it, you'll realize that like this is a mistake. And this is why it's really important to code review what the AI is doing overall. Okay, so what's next? So I want to take a stab at the resume builder and the sprint estimator. The resume builder I actually kind of already had working, so I'm kind of considering to see if it can go into that code base, take some of that code and put that code into this code base. So that would be really cool to see how well it can like reuse code from one folder to another folder. It's in a completely separate kind of like repository in my computer, so I want to see how well it does that. But there is some complexity with the resume builder where like it uploads a JSON, there's a preview, right? And then it allows you to download the resume as a markdown, right? So some of those things are complex, but like I said, this is already built. So this is like a next iteration of a slightly more complicated feature that I feel like a calculator is just solved. And then I want to go down to a sprint estimator. I'm going to have this is going to be built brand new from scratch. I do have like a template CSV that I want to use. I eventually want to manipulate that and make it that or like a really complicated CSV and see how it would handle that. So it's just TBD on all the capabilities on how well it does CSV parsing, how well it can load that data, how well it can use that data to set values, and then most importantly, generate the charts of like, hey, what are your sprint velocities going to look like based off of the data provided. So there's definitely some complexities into both of these. I think one is kind of already solved, and one is the next component. Again, if you notice from my earlier slide, I really want to focus on just front-end web apps for now, keep it pretty simple. Now that I did think about this, like, specification schema and getting all of that organized, I could probably get, a better front end and back end application by creating like an API contract built in into the file structure before I even start the project, just getting it to generate like a markdown file with all of the APIs. And then when I go and generate the front end and the back end application separately, it should be able to handle that. But yeah, I just want to hold off on that. I want to focus on building this giant this giant front end web app with all of these tools, and then eventually adding some tools that would use some more back end, and then afterwards adding a tool that would potentially use AI underneath the covers. So that's all for me. Thanks so much for watching. Tune in for our next update.